Good morning, everyone. I am Harry Garcia, your reporter for today. So for today's discussion, we will discuss about the Japanese literature. Here's some brief history about Japan. Japan have heavy cultural influence from China and Korea in terms of Buddhism, ways of farming, art, language, and letters. And in 12th to 19th century, samurai ruled shogun. Emperor was only figured head. In 1853, American Commodore Matthew Perry, or with four warship, requested Japan to begin trading. And on 1868, after Civil War, Shogun resigns and Emperor restored to power. Once again, he is truly in charge of Japan. Emperor begins modernization of country, abolishes samurai class and feudal system. There are other Japanese literature in which are kabuki, no, and haiku. First, we need to talk about the No. No is the oldest formalized by 1400s. No stories are spiritual in nature. It's such as ghosts, demons, and possessions. Masks are worn. Audience is aristocratic or upper class. And No is elegant and refined. No is a simple set, little or no props. And No has three sides for audience to connect dressing room and separated by curtain and accompanied by music or chorus. So here is the non-traditional theater. And next, we talk about kabuki. Kabuki developed around 1600s. Kabuki stories based on folklore, history, and highly stylized makeup. And kabuki appeals to middle class audience that often yells during performance. Kabuki bountiful and exaggerated. Kabuki elaborate sets, often using special effects. Kabuki also extensive used for props, especially the fan. And Kabuki stage has one side. Kabuki accompanied by music or chorus. Kabuki or Omnagata is a male performing as females. The contemporary influence of Kabuki and No. Japanese anime or cartoons and manga or comic books and costume or makeup designed for modern movies, such as Star Wars. Next, let us talk about the haiku. Haiku is a form of minimalist Japanese poetry. Haiku theme is, or are, rather, nature or seasons. And haiku attempts to the deep or compare it to unlike things. Haiku consists of 3 lines and a certain number of syllables per line. Haiku has 5-7-5 syllabic structure. So here are some examples of Japanese haiku. The first cold shower, even the monkey seems to want a little coat of straw. So here's our some famous haiku masters. First is Matsuo Basho. Matsuo Basho wrote, "First day of spring, I kept thinking about the end of autumn. Spring rain leaking through the roof, dripping from the wasp nest. Fallen sick on a journey, in dreams I rhyme wildly over a withered moor. An old silent pond, a frog jumps into the pond, splash, silence again. The first soft snow, enough to bend the leaves of the jonquil log. In the cicada's cry, no sign can foretell how soon it must be die. No one travels along this way but I, this autumn evening. In all the rains of May, there is one thing not hidden, the bridge at Seta Bay. The year first day, thoughts and loneliness, the autumn dusk is here. Clouds appear, and bring to men a chance to rest from looking at the moon. Harvest moon around the pond, I wander, and the night is gone. Poverty's child, he started to glean the rice and gazes at the moon. No blossoms and no moon, and he is drinking sake all alone. Won't you come and see loneliness? Just one leaf from the kiri tree, temple bells die out, the fragrant blossom remain a perfect evening. Next haiku master named Ryunosuke Akutagawa, and he wrote, "Green frog, is your body also freshly painted? Sick and feverish glints of cherry blossoms still shivering." The next haiku master named Yosabuson. At the over-matured sushi, the master is full of regret. Pressing sushi, after a while, a lonely feeling. A whale down it goes, and more up goes its fail. The second to the last haiku master named Etsuji, and he wrote, "Covered with the flowers, instantly I'd like to die in this dream of ours." The last haiku master named Kobayashi Isa, and he wrote, "In my old home, which I forsook, the cherries are in bloom. A giant firefly, the way, this way, that way, this and it passes by. Right at my feet, and when did you get there, snail? My grumbling wife, if only she were here this moon tonight. An only thing to see through the paper windows hold the galaxy. A man, just one, also a fly, just one, in the huge drawing room. A sudden shower falls, and naked I am riding on a naked horse." Now let's talk about the period of Japanese literature. First is Yamato or Kofan period in 300 to 7. Prince Shotoku Komukara period in 573 to 621. Prince Shotoku Komukara period regent during reign of Empress Suiko, and wrote the 17th article constitution, the earliest piece of Japanese writing and basis for Japanese government throughout history, and led Japanese court in adopting Chinese calendar and in sponsoring Buddhism. Next is the Asuka period that start in 641 to 710. Asuka period is the capital in the Asuka district. Establishment of imperial power under Taika Reform Edict. Temple building and sculpture introduced with Buddhism, heavily influenced by Korean and Chinese models. So next is the Naiku. Naiku is the most respected of all shrines. The Naiku is located at Izu. The Naiku preserves Amaterasu Omikami, the ancestral goddess of Japan's imperial house and the great ancestral holy being of Japanese people. So here is the example of Amaterasu Omikami. Next is the Nara period of 710 to 794. Nara period is the first permanent capital established at Nara. Emperors embraced Buddhism, leading to its rapid and dramatic expansion. Rise in political power of Buddhist monasteries led to capital being moved to Nagawaka. So here is the Nara fashion. And today I will show you the Buddha sculpture. And now, let us talk about the earliest Japanese literature. First, the Kojiki, record of ancient matters, an anthology of myths, legends, and other stories. Next is the Fudoki, records of wind and earth, compiled by provincial officials, describe the history, geographic products, and folklore of the various provinces. Is the Nihon Shoki, the Chronicle of Japan, a chronological record of history. And now, let us talk about the Kojiki. Kojiki is the Japan's first book. It was written in 712 by the noble Ono Yasumaru at the order of Empress Gemini and is in 3 volumes. The Kojiki it recounts the history of Japan from its methodology or mythological origins to the era of the Empress Suiko. And the Kojiki is the record of ancient matters. Let us talk about the Manyoshu. Manyoshu is the collection of 10,000 lives, anthology of over 4,500 poems, includes wide variety of poems, courtly, rustic, dialectical, military, and travel, identified and anonymous poets. And its syllabic poetry of 575 like haiku na choka indeterminate number of lines culminating in a 7 syllable or mora couplet. Next is tanka. Tanka is 31 syllable poem. It's 57577 syllabic. And now, let us talk about the Heian Japan. In 794 to 1185, Heian Japan, capital of Heian, present-day Kyoto, highly formalized court culture, aristocratic monopoly of power. And Heian Japan is literary and artistic flowering, ended in civil wars and emergence of samurai culture. And now, let us talk about the Kokinshu. Kokinshu is the collection of ancient and modern times. Anthology commissioned by Emperor Daigo. And 1111 is Tanka poems in 20 books. Books divided by subject, such as love, seasons, felicitations, party, travel, names of things, and etc. Renga or link verse is a pairs of group of poets would compose jointly, with one poet supplying the initial 575 of a verse and another the concluding 77, often building up to 100 verse sequences. Is the Heian style. Heian style is a culture more independent of Chinese influence, emphasized on the exquisite and evanescent literary poems, letters, pillow books, and extreme sensitivity to nature, nocturnal, and importance of convention and fashion. Heian painting Yamatoe. Onae, rich colors and subtle outlines, the medium for courtliness appropriate to the literature of Miyabi, such as The Tale of Genji. Cutaway painting in which interior scenes are painted by cutting away the roof, primarily concerned with the Japanese life that goes on inside the court or house. Otokoe, strong calligraphic outlines on figures with wash color so that these strong lines would not be overwhelmed by the color. The medium for action subjects involving war or conflict, primarily concerned with the public life outside the court or house. Next is the Heian literature. Men continued to write Chinese-style poetry. Then the women began to write in Japanese prose. First novel is Genji Monogatari by Lady Murasaki Shikibu. The diaries, the pillow book by Sei Shonagan, As I Crossed a Bridge of Dreams by Lady Sarashina. In Japanese writing, adapted from Chinese calligraphy but a totally different language. Kanji is the grammatic use of Chinese characters. Manyukana, ideogrammatic and syllabic. Kana, syllabic. Hiragana is a woman writing Cursive doesn't require knowledge of Chinese. Katakana, cursive derived from Chinese. Now, let us talk about The Tale of Genji by Lady Murasaki. The Tale of Genji, picture of life at the 10th century Heian court, relates the lives and loves of Prince Genji and his children and grandchildren. UNESCO Global Heritage Pavilion, The Tale of Genji. The modern Japanese writing system uses three manuscripts, which are the kanji, the kana, and under the kana, there are hiragana, katakana, and next is kanji, katakana, hiragana. And now, let us listen to the next report.
Classical period. The classical period, meaning literature from the earliest times up to the March of 1868, is customarily divided by literary scholar. Jodai covers Japanese literature history through the Nara period. Chuko is used more or less synonymously with the literature of Heian period. Kinsei is the most often used to refer Edo period. The literature of antiquity. Written literature in Japan dates from the Nara period, although an oral tradition existed well before the time. Manyoshu is the oldest existing collection of Japanese poetry, compiled sometime during Nara period. The collection is divided into 20 parts or books. The collection contains Choka, Tanka, Tanrenga, Busokuseki ka, Kanchi. The literature of Middle Antiquity. Literature in the early Heian period flourished under Chinese influence, but became more expansive of naive sentiments as Japan. Chinese poetry was supplanted by the waka, also known as literary Japan song, as the preeminent literary form. The decline of the aristocracy toward the end of the period was apparelled by the loss of creative energy and growing sense of pessimism. Waka. Waka is a genre of classical Japanese verse and one of the major genres of Japanese literature. The term came during the Heian period and used to distinguish Japanese language poetry from kanji, also known as poetry written in Chinese by Japanese poets. The exchange of waka were called ginu-ginu because it was thought the man wanted to stay with his lover. There were two types of waka, the utakai and uta-awase. Utaka was a party in which a particular wrote a waka and recited them. Uta-awase is a contest of two teams. The literature of Middle Ages. The political associated Genpei Wars of 1180 to 1185 and the establishment of Kamakura Bakufu. Mujo became a key concept underlying the literature of the period. The literature of recent past, the Edo period, was characterized by growing cultural influence exercised by samurai and town people. The Haikai master Masuo Basho, the novelist Ihara Sakakli, and the dramalist Shikamli Mozawaimon are all associated with this a hormone of creative activity. Gesaku by the writers who continuated the last literature generate on before.
Ian Eyocampo. For today's discussion, I will discuss to you the modern Japanese period. Modern Japanese period can be divided into four periods. First, in year 16,000 to 1868, the period of Tokugawa shoguns. Feudal political order with economic and social change occurring in a gradual manner. This period saw growing urbanization. the spread of popular education, and the rise of merchant class. Second, year 1868 to 1890, the early Meiji period. Rapid modernization and dramatic change of political, social, and economic institutions, meeting the challenge of the West by following its model. Third, year 1890 to 1945, Imperial Japan, constitutional policy with the emperor as reigning monarch. Industrialization, urbanization, and an increasingly mobile society. Drive for international status and world power, including imperialism in Asia and finally war with the United States. Year 1945 to present, contemporary Japan, democratic reform under Allied occupation, stable political democracy, high economic growth in the 60s and 70s, followed by political instability and recession in the early 90s. Next, let us discuss the background to the Meiji Restoration. By the middle of 19th century, Japan's ruling shogunate was a weak, feudal order, unable to control all its own domains, much less defend the nation against the threat from the Western powers. This threat materialized in 1853 with the arrival of Commodore Matthew Perry and a squadron of the U.S. Navy, demanding that Japan open commerce with the West. The result was a series of unequal treaties, in which Japan was forced to concede special economic and legal privileges to the Western powers. Besides, Japan lay China, weak and humiliated, an example of what could befall a great Asian nation unable to defend itself against Western imperialism. Determined that Japan should not share China's fate, and convinced that modernization depends on abolishing a feudal order, a group of middle-ranking samurai overthrew the military government of the shogun in 1868 and set Japan peaceably on a course of radical modernization perhaps unparalleled in history. Carried out the name of restoring rule to the emperor, who then took the reign name Meiji, meaning enlightened rule. The Meiji Restoration was in many ways a profound revolution. Next, the Meiji Restoration and Modernization in year 1868 to 1890. The new leaders studied the political, economic, and social institution of the Western power and selectively adopted those suited to their purpose. In 1889, a constitution was promulgated which established a parliamentary government but left it accountable to the emperor rather than to the people. Administrative power was centralized in the national bureaucracy, which also ruled in the name of the emperor. The classes were declared equal, so that samurai and their lords lost their feudal privileges, while the role of merchants, formerly despised as profit-hungry, began to be respected. The enthusiastic adoption of the new Western technologies caused an explosion of industrial productivity and diversification. A national militarity and universal conscription were established. Compulsory public education was introduced both to teach the skill needed for a new nation and to inculcate values of citizenship in all Japanese. Next, the Imperial Japan, industrialization and expansion in year 1890 to 1930. This period was a time of social and economic change within the constitutional monarchy established in 1890. As the original architect of restoration died, the various branches of the government began to competing for power. An oligarchy bound closely by its members, shared conception of national purpose was replaced by an aggregate of interest groups, the parliament, civil bureaucracy, military, and imperial household, all vying for ear of emperor, in whose name they administered the government. Japanese industry expanded, both in light export industries like textiles, which were necessary to pay the raw materials needed from abroad, and also in heavy industries like steel and shipbuilding. Cities grew as more Japanese moved from farming into jobs in factories and offices. In the countryside, larger landlords came to own more and more land, and the number of poor tenants increased. Always dependent on foreign trade, Japan was hard hit by the World Depression that began in 1929. The farmers who had grown the silk that was exported to the United States found no market for their product once the Roaring Twenties and the craze for silk stocking collapsed with the stock market crash. Japan's dramatic economic growth slowed, and social problems increased, especially in the countryside. At the same time that the leaders of Imperial Japan pursued modernization and economic growth, they continued to address the issue of Japan's unequal status in international order. In 1894, more than 40 years after Commodore Perry Pride Japan opened the outside world, Japan finally succeeded in revising the unequal treaties so that it regained its legal parity with the Western powers. Japan fought a war against China in 1894 to 1895 over the control of Korea and gained Taiwan, Japan's first colony. In 1902, Japan signed an alliance with Great Britain, which signified a dramatic increase in international status. And in 1904 to 1905, Japan won a war against Russia, one of the major Western powers. In the process, Japan expanded its empire, annexing Korea in 1910. Japan was allied with the United States and Britain in World War I and expected territorial gains at Versailles Peace Conference in 1919. Instead, Japan met with strong opposition from the United States and again learned the lesson that the West regarded imperialism very differently if it was the imperialism of an Asian rather than European power. The failure of Japanese to get a clause in racial equality inserted into the Covenant of League of Nations was an insult that was compounded in 1924 when the United States barred all Japanese from immigration. Another, Japan's quest for power in World War II in Asia. The impatience of field commanders in Manchuria finally showed in 1931 when they used a local provocation as an excuse to put all the Japanese territory in Manchuria under control of the military. The move presented Japan's civilian government at home with an accomplishment that it could not afford to ignore. The military-industrial machine went into high gear, pulling Japan out of its depression as it continued to expand Japanese hegemony across the Far East. As Holland, France, and Germany were enveloped in turmoil in Europe, Japan looked to replace them in Asia. Japanese troops invaded China in 1937 and French Indochina in 1940, setting up puppet governments to administer areas too vast to be controlled by the Japanese armies. Alarmed by Japan's increasing usurpation of Western prerogatives in Far East and disregarded for the rights of local populations, the United States delivered an ultimatum to Japan, steel, and all export to Japan would be cut off unless Japan go out of China. In the context of rapidly worsening relations, Japan decided to make a daring surprise attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, where 90% of U.S. Navy was deployed. The preemptive strike bought Japan time. It took the United States many times its superior in industrial strength in a full year to gain the offensive on Japan. Japan's strings of early successes, the Philippines, Hong Kong, British Malaya, and Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies, left its navy scattered across the Pacific, while its army was bogged down in China. When the United States recovered its forces lost in Pearl Harbor, its navy and army were able to conduct an island-hopping strategy of cutting off the Japanese commands one by one from their supply routes. By 1945, the U.S. forces were close enough to launch damaging bombing attacks from nearby islands against Japan itself. Its cities devastated by firebombing, its economy barely functioning, and its people on the brink of starvation. The Japanese government still held out hope that with the assistance of Russians, Swiss, or Swedes, they would be able to negotiate an end to the war. Unaware of the secret agreement among allies at Yalta, Japan was shocked when Russia too entered the war against Japan. 2 days earlier, the United States had dropped the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima, a medium-sized industrial city. The day after the Russian declaration of war, the second atomic bomb was dropped on Nagasaki, the port city where Japan had first opened itself to Westerners. Japan agreed, and the emperor himself went on the radio to make announcement of surrender to the Japanese people. Second to the last is post-war Japan in year 1945 to 1989. For the next 7 years, Allied powers occupied Japan. After Japan's military forces were mobilized and repatriated the occupation, led by the General Douglas MacArthur of U.S. Army, turned to the problem of making Japan democratic with the hope that its people would never again be led to fight war of aggression. To that end, in 1947, a new constitution was adopted with 2 key provisions. Sovereignty was transferred from the emperor to the people, and Japan, as nation, renounced war and the right to build a military force. Under land reform, tenant farmers were given the land they worked, and industrial workers were allowed to form trade unions. Zaibatsu, or large business combines, which had been part of the military-industrial machine, were partially dismantled. Democracy was popularized in media and schools, and the moral training that had fostered extreme nationalism was abolished. Most of the reforms made under the occupation have been retained by Japan. The United States changed some of more liberal provisions it had encouraged early in the occupation as it grew more fearfully of communism in the Cold War. With American support, Japan rebuilt many of wartime industry to apply U.S. forces in the Korean War and entered into a security treaty with the United States, which established Japan in an important role in America's Asian defense strategy. In 1952, the U.S. occupation of Japan ended, and by 1955, the Japanese economy had regained its highest pre-war production levels. A stable political system was also established with the conservative and pro-American liberal Democratic Party's control of the government. From the 60s through the mid-80s, domestic politics were stable. The Liberal Democratic Party maintained a solid majority in the Diet Parliament and emphasized close relations with the United States. Japan also achieved record economic growth, averaging 10% a year until 70s. Its economy grew from one less productive than Italy to the third largest in the world, behind only United States and Soviet Union. Growth was especially strong in heavy industry, such as steel, chemicals and machinery, and in advanced technology. Almost totally dependent on imports for foods and energy. Japan began to face increasing protectionism abroad and serious pollution problems at home. Although Japan has brought pollution under control, trade frictions continue. As one of the most advanced post-industrial societies in the world, the Japanese people enjoy prosperity and the benefits of a thriving middle-class society. And lastly, the year 1989 to present. In year 1989, in an entirely accidental coincidence, the Showa Emperor Hirohito died and Berlin Wall fell, both in the same year. The death of Emperor, who had come to the throne in 1926, meant the end in Japan of the long era that included the war, trans-war, and the post-war as well. And the close of the Cold War in the West meant the end of global geopolitical system that had provided Japan international shelter with American imperium. 2 years later, the economic bubble burst and Japan went into a lengthy recession. Another 2 years passed and the Liberal Democratic Party fell, much the way the shogunate had collapsed so many years ago. Without a revolution, 6 prime ministers held office between year 1989 and year 1996, an orderly turnover that was nonetheless routinely described as political chaos. Japanese society was aging rapidly, its elderly increasing and its birth rate dropping. The 1.57 shock of 1990 brought fertility well below the level required for demographic replacement. Even more shocking to some was the increasing number of younger urban women who were refusing to marry or choosing not to bear children. The Gulf War of 1991 administered an international shock to Japan's constitution, raising the post-Cold War question of sending uniformed troops to participate peacekeeping operations abroad and challenging the customary practices of post-war pacifism. And the nation of Asia, now increasingly important to Japan's economic and geopolitical relation, made even more insistent demands on Japanese to acknowledge and apologize for their early acts of colonialism and wartime aggression. The year following, in year 1989, will one day be viewed, no doubt, as another historical conjuncture of global import, not simply because the Cold War was ended, but because so many other things were happening at the same time. And that's all about the Japanese modern period. Thank you.
Contribution of the Japanese culture to the world. For the pool, Japanese food 82 is equivalent to 37.10%. Instant noodles 52 is equivalent to 23.53%. Japanese cars 79 is equivalent to 35.79%. Anime and manga 97 is equivalent to 43.89%. digital watches and calculators, 40 is equivalent to 18.10%. Electronics in general, 98 is equivalent to 44.43%. Robots, 53 is equivalent to 23.98%. Toto toilets with seat warmer, bidet, and etc., 29 is equivalent to 13.12%. VHS videotapes, 33 is equivalent to 14.93%. Video games, 91 is equivalent to 41.18%. Martial arts, judo, karate, kendo, and etc., 60 is equivalent to 27.15%. Karaoke, 40 is equivalent to 18.10%. J-pop, 32 is equivalent to 14.48%. Japanese women, 78 is equivalent to 35.29%. Hentai and AV, 28 is equivalent to 12.67%. Purikura, photo sticker, 17 is equivalent to 7.69%. Japanese men, 23 is equivalent to 10.41%. The Japanese performing arts have made some unique contributions to world culture. For example, Kabuki Theater. Kabuki is a classical Japanese dance drama. Kabuki Theater is known for the stylization of its drama, the often glamorous costumes worn by performers, and for the elaborate kumadori makeup worn by some of its performance. No Theater. No is a major form of classical Japanese dance drama that has been performed since 14th century, developed by Kanami and his son Zaimi. It is the oldest major theater art that is still regularly performed today. Bunraku Puppet Theater. Bunraku, also known as Ningyo Jururi, is a form of traditional Japanese puppet theater founded in Osaka in the beginning of the 17th century. 3 kinds of performers take part in Bunraku performance: the Ningyo Chukai or Ningyo Zukai, the Taiyu, and shamisen musicians. Geisha. Geisha, geiko, or geigi are a class of female entertainers from Japan trained in traditional styles of performing arts such as Japanese dance and singing. Their distinct appearance is characterized by long trailing kimono, traditional hairstyles, and the oshiroi makeup. Musical instrument. A musical instrument is a device created or adapted to make musical sounds. In principle, any object that produces sounds can be considered a musical instrument. It is through purpose that the object becomes a musical instrument. The history of musical instrument dates to the beginning of human culture. The quieter and more contemplative arts have developed following worldwide: Sado, tea ceremony; Kodo, the way of incense; Ikebana, flower arranging; Ukiyo, woodblock prints; Bonsai, miniature trees; Origami, paper folding; classical literature and modern literature. Japanese royalty has a history dating back many centuries. Imperial family. The government of Japan is a constitutional monarchy where the power of the emperor is very limited. As a ceremonial figurehead, he is defined by the Constitution of Japan, Constitution by the Prime Minister of Japan, and other elected members of the Diet, while sovereignty is vested in Japanese people. The emperor effectively acts as the head of state on diplomatic occasions. Akihito is the current emperor of Japan. Naruhito, Crown Prince of Japan, stands as next in line to the throne. Many cultural events fill out the annual calendar with something in every season. First, annual festivals, annual holidays, 4 seasons, hanami, cherry blossom viewing. Japanese costume is unique, differing greatly even from those of other Asian cultures. Kimono. Kimono, a long, loose robe with wide sleeves and tied with a sash, originally worn as a formal garment in Japan and now also used in somewhere else as a robe. Footwear. Footwear refers to the garments worn on the feet, which originally serves to purpose of protection against adversities of the environment, usually regarding ground textures and temperatures. Footwear in the manner of shoes, therefore, primarily serves the purpose to ease the locomotion and prevent injuries. Japanese food, sushi is in particular, is popular around the world and renowned for its health benefits. The basic of Japanese cuisine, popular dishes, and alcohol, sake, beer, and more.